It was a Friday afternoon in Chicago, May 25th, 1979. The skies above O'Hare International Airport were completely clear, not a single cloud anywhere in sight. Visibility was 15 miles in every direction. The temperature was 63 degrees. A light northeast wind was blowing at 22 knots. By every measurable standard, it was a perfect day to fly. 258 passengers walked through that terminal, checked their bags, found their seats, and buckled their seatbelts. It was the start of Memorial Day weekend, one of the busiest travel days on the American calendar. Families were heading home after long weeks away. Business travelers were wrapping up their Friday and looking forward to the weekend. A magazine editor and his wife had settled into their seats, probably talking about Los Angeles, probably thinking about nothing in particular. A celebrated biomedical inventor, a man whose work in cardiac medicine had genuinely saved thousands of lives, was somewhere in that cabin, looking out the window at Chicago. Not one of those 258 people had a single reason to feel afraid. Not one of them had any warning. And 31 seconds after that aircraft left the ground, every single one of them was gone. This is the true story of American Airlines Flight 191. And every word you're about to hear comes directly from the official NTSB Investigation Report. Before we talk about what happened on that runway, you need to understand something. Because there is a question that people have been asking about this accident for more than 40 years. And that question is this: how does a modern commercial aircraft, operated by one of the largest airlines in the world, flown by one of the most experienced crews in the industry, on a clear afternoon with perfect weather, fall out of the sky 31 seconds after takeoff? The answer is not what most people expect. It is not pilot error. It is not a freak mechanical failure that nobody could have anticipated. The answer is a decision, a deliberate decision made weeks before that flight, in a maintenance hangar in Tulsa, Oklahoma. A decision made to save time. A decision made to save money. A decision that nobody reported, nobody stopped, and nobody reversed. And when you hear exactly what that decision was, and exactly what it set in motion, I think you will understand why this accident changed aviation safety forever. Captain Walter Lux was 53 years old. He had been flying commercial aircraft since before some of his passengers were born. He had been flying the DC-10 specifically since the day it entered service. Since August 5th, 1971, 8 years before this flight. He had logged approximately 22,000 total flying hours across his career. 22,000 hours in the air. He was qualified to fly 17 different aircraft types, including the DC-6, the DC-7, and the Boeing 727. He was not assigned to Flight 191 originally. He had swapped onto this route from another schedule, a routine change that pilots make all the time. Sitting to his right was First Officer James Dillard, 49 years old, with 9,275 hours of his own. Behind them, both in the cockpit, was Flight Engineer Alfred Udovich, 56 years old, with 15,000 hours of experience. The three men in that cockpit had accumulated, between them, more than 46,000 hours in commercial aviation. They had handled emergencies. They had dealt with mechanical issues. They knew this aircraft. The aircraft itself was a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, registration number N110AA. A wide-body trijet with 3 engines, one mounted under each wing and one at the base of the vertical tail. It had entered service in 1972 and had accumulated more than 20,000 flight hours of its own without a single major incident. On the day of the accident, a review of the aircraft's maintenance log showed no discrepancies, no outstanding issues, no deferred maintenance items of concern. On paper, N110AA was airworthy in every respect. And yet, somewhere inside the structure of that left wing, where the engine pylon connected to the aircraft, a crack was waiting. A crack that had been growing, silently, invisibly, for 8 weeks. At 2:50 in the afternoon, Flight 191 pushed back from Gate K5. The maintenance crews who were present at the gate during the engine start and pushback observed nothing unusual. No abnormal sounds, no warning flags, no reason for concern. The aircraft taxied to runway 32 right and held in position. Inside the cabin, flight attendants completed their safety demonstration. Passengers put away their bags and adjusted their seats. Some were already reading. Some were looking out the windows at the Chicago skyline. Some were probably already thinking about what they were going to do when they landed in Los Angeles. At 3:02 p.m., the control tower cleared Flight 191 for takeoff. Captain Walter Lux acknowledged the clearance. His voice was calm and professional, the way it always was after 22,000 hours. He said, "American 191, underway." Those were the last words Flight 191 ever transmitted to anyone on the ground. The DC-10 began its takeoff roll, all 3 engines at full power, the aircraft accelerating down the runway, building speed, vibrating the way jets do on the ground before they leave it. First Officer Dillard was calling out the airspeed as the numbers climbed. 80 knots, everything normal. 100 knots, still normal. 120 knots. Approaching V1, the decision speed, the point after which there is no stopping on the runway. Then rotation speed. The nose of the DC-10 lifted. The main gear left the ground. The aircraft was climbing. And then, 2 seconds after the wheels left runway, 32 right, the cockpit voice recorder captured a sound that lasted less than a second. A single dull thump. 1 second after that thump, one word was spoken somewhere in that cockpit. Just one word. Damn. And then the cockpit voice recorder went completely dark. It had lost all power. It would never record another sound from the crew of Flight 191. In the entire history of aviation disasters, there are few last words as quietly devastating as that one. Damn. Not a shout. Not a scream. Just one word from a professional who understood, in that fraction of a second, that something had gone very wrong. What caused that thump was something that people standing at O'Hare International Airport that afternoon would describe for the rest of their lives. The number 1 engine, the left engine, tore completely away from the wing. Not a gradual loosening, not a partial separation. The entire engine, along with its pylon mounting assembly, and approximately 3 feet of the leading edge of the left wing, detached from the aircraft in a single violent instant. And then, it did something that nobody watching could immediately process. The engine did not fall straight down beneath the aircraft. According to the official NTSB Investigation report, the engine flipped over the top of the wing, rotating up and over the leading edge, and crashed back down onto the runway behind the departing jet. A local news crew happened to be at the airport filming unrelated footage that afternoon. Their camera was rolling. They caught the moment on video. That footage exists today. You can watch an entire jet engine, the size of a school bus, tumbling through the air over the runway at O'Hare, while the aircraft it had just been attached to continues climbing into the sky above Chicago. Witnesses in the terminal pressed against the glass. People in the parking structure stopped walking and stared. Drivers on roads adjacent to the airport pulled over. One witness told the Associated Press that he simply could not believe what he was seeing. Another described the aircraft banking and going straight down, like nothing he had ever seen. The control tower saw it happen in real time. They got on the radio immediately. They called Flight 191 and asked if the aircraft needed to return to the airport. There was no response. There would never be a response. Because by the time the tower made that call, the crew of Flight 191 was already fighting for their lives with instruments that were lying to them and warnings that had gone silent. Now here is the part of the story that the NTSB investigation would later describe as the most critical technical finding. Because here is what most people do not understand about this accident. Losing an engine on takeoff is an emergency. It is serious, but it is not automatically fatal. The DC-10 was certified and designed to continue flight on 2 engines. There are documented cases in aviation history of DC-10s losing an engine and landing safely. The crew of Flight 191 knew this. They were trained for exactly this scenario. Engine number 1 was gone, but they still had 2 engines running. They still had lift. They still had a flyable aircraft, or so they believed. Because what the crew did not know, and what they had no way of knowing, was that the engine separation had done far more damage than simply removing one source of thrust. When that engine and pylon tore away from the wing, it severed the hydraulic lines that held the leading edge slats on the left wing in their extended position. Slats are the panels along the front of the wing that change its aerodynamic shape at lower speeds, reducing the speed at which the wing produces lift. With the hydraulic lines cut, the slats on the left wing retracted. They folded back into the wing. Aerodynamic forces completed what the hydraulics had started, pulling those slats back even as the aircraft was still climbing. The right wing still had its slats fully extended. The left wing did not. The 2 wings of the aircraft were now operating in fundamentally different aerodynamic conditions. The left wing needed more speed to keep flying, and the crew had no idea. The instrument that would have shown them a slat disagreement, the warning light that should have been flashing on that cockpit panel, had also been disabled in the separation. The stall warning system, the device that sounds an alarm before a wing loses lift, was also gone, its power supply cut by the same separation event. Captain Lux and First Officer Dillard were flying an aircraft that had been fundamentally altered in ways they could not detect. They had no warning light. They had no stall alarm. They had no indication from their instruments that the left wing was operating differently from the right. All they knew was that they had lost an engine, and they responded to that exactly as they had been trained to. The emergency procedure for engine failure on the DC-10 required the crew to reduce airspeed to a value called V2, the engine out climb speed. It is the correct procedure. It has been the correct procedure for decades. It is the procedure that has allowed countless aircraft to survive engine failures and land safely. Captain Lux and his crew flew it precisely. They slowed the aircraft toward V2. They were doing everything right. But the NTSB investigation would later determine, through exhaustive post-accident testing, that the V2 speed they were targeting was now below the stall speed of the left wing as it was currently configured. By following the correct emergency procedure, the procedure they had practiced in simulators, the procedure they were required to fly, they were unknowingly reducing their airspeed to a point that would cause the left wing to stop producing lift entirely. There was no alarm to stop them. There was no light to warn them. There was nothing in that cockpit to tell them that the one thing they were trained to do in this emergency was the one thing that would make it unsurvivable. The NTSB brought in experienced test pilots after the accident. Pilots who were fully briefed on exactly what had happened. Pilots who knew about the slat retraction, who knew about the stall warning failure, who knew exactly what to watch for. Even those pilots, with all that knowledge and all that preparation, struggled to recover the aircraft once the roll began. And the safety board concluded formally, in language that should be remembered, it was not reasonable to expect the pilots of Flight 191 either to have recognized the beginning of the roll as a stall or to recover from it, given the circumstances and the loss of the systems designed to warn them. They were not at fault. They performed correctly under impossible conditions. They did everything they were trained to do, and they still had no chance. At 325 feet above the ground, the left wing stalled. The aircraft began to roll to the left. It started slowly, almost gently at first, almost as if the aircraft was simply turning, then faster. The nose dropped below the horizon. The DC-10 rolled past 90 degrees of bank, past vertical, until it was completely inverted, upside down, at a bank angle of 112 degrees, the nose pointing 21 degrees below the horizon, aimed directly at the earth below. There was nothing the crew could have done. There was nothing anyone in that cockpit could have done. At 3:04 p.m., 31 seconds after the wheels left, runway 32, right, American Airlines Flight 191 struck the ground in an open field 4,600 feet northwest of the runway. The wreckage scattered across the field and into the adjacent trailer park. Several vehicles and a mobile home were destroyed. The aircraft was obliterated on impact. The fire was total and immediate. All 271 people on board were killed on impact. 2 people on the ground lost their lives as well. It was over in half a minute. The deadliest aviation accident in the history of the United States. The National Transportation Safety Board arrived at the crash site within hours and began what would become a 6-month investigation. The scale of the destruction was unlike anything most of those investigators had encountered at a domestic crash site. Because the aircraft had been carrying a full transcontinental fuel load for the flight to Los Angeles. The fire at impact had been catastrophic. The largest identifiable pieces of the aircraft remaining after the fire were the 3 engines, the landing gear assemblies, and a portion of the tail section. Everything else had been reduced to fragments and ash. Recovery workers spent weeks moving through the debris field. The aircraft maintenance records, which were required by standard procedure to be removed from the aircraft before departure, a step that was not completed on the day of the accident, had been destroyed along with everything else in the fire. But the physical evidence told a story that no document could have told more clearly. When investigators examined the pylon attachment points, the metal fittings and brackets that had held the left engine to the wing structure, they found a specific pattern of damage on the wing mounting bracket. A shaped indentation that matched precisely the contours of the pylon rear attachment fitting. Investigators understood immediately what this meant. The only physical scenario that could have produced this exact pattern of damage was one in which the engine mounting bolts had been removed, and the entire engine pylon assembly experienced the exact same type of pylon damage using the exact same modified removal procedure on 2 separate DC-10 aircraft. The first incident occurred in December of 1978. The second in February of 1979. In both cases, mechanics working on the aircraft had actually heard the sound of the metal fracturing during the procedure. They heard it happen. In both cases, Continental Airlines classified the event internally as a maintenance error and handled it within the company. In both cases, they did not report the incident to McDonnell Douglas, did not report it to the Federal Aviation Administration, did not issue any safety communication to other carriers who were using the same procedure. If either of those reports had been filed, if a single safety bulletin had been issued after the first Continental incident in December of 1978, the modified forklift procedure would have been identified as dangerous and prohibited. American Airlines would have been required to change their maintenance process. the crack on N110AA might never have formed. 275 people might have gone home that Friday evening. The maintenance supervisor at the Tulsa facility, who had overseen the procedure on N110AA, was a man named Earl Russell Marshall. When McDonnell Douglas attorneys began preparing to take his deposition as part of the legal proceedings that followed the crash, Earl Russell Marshall died by suicide the night before he was scheduled to testify. He never spoke about what happened in that hangar in March of 1979. American Airlines was fined $500,000 by the United States government. The FAA suspended the DC-10 type certificate on June 6th of 1979, grounding every DC-10 in American airspace for 37 days. The NTSB issued 23 separate safety findings. A maintenance worker named Joe White had raised concerns about the modified forklift procedure before the accident. Management dismissed his concerns. He was right. In October of 2011, a permanent memorial was dedicated near the crash site in Des Plaines, Illinois. A garden, a brick wall. Each brick carries the name of someone who did not come home that Friday afternoon. Every year on May 25th at 3:01 p.m., family members and friends gather at that wall. They turn west, toward O'Hare, toward runway 32 right, and they stand in silence for exactly 31 seconds. The same 31 seconds that Flight 191 was in the air. I want you to count that right now. Count 31 seconds in your head. That is how long it took. That is all the time there was. Flight 191 is a story about a shortcut that cost 275 lives. It is a story about silence, about companies that knew and said nothing. It is a story about pilots who did everything right and were given no chance. And it is a story about how the safety system that protects every person who boards a commercial aircraft today was not designed in a conference room. It was built in a wreckage field in Des Plaines. It was written in 23 NTSB findings. It was paid for in names on a brick wall. Today, because of what happened on that clear Friday afternoon in May of 1979, every critical maintenance procedure on every commercial aircraft must be formally documented, independently reviewed, and certified before that aircraft returns to service. The loophole that killed Flight 191 no longer exists, because 275 people boarded a plane on a perfect day in Chicago and never landed. We remember them. If this investigation reached you, if this story stayed with you, subscribe to this channel right now. Every week we go through the official investigation reports, the black box recordings, and the NTSB findings, and we tell you exactly what happened and exactly why. No theories, no speculation. Just the truth, sourced directly from the official record every single time. The next investigation is already in production. Hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.